The rusted logging chain had been bolted directly through the rotted floorboard of a gutted international pickup, and the Belgian Malinois tethered to the end of it had not felt dry ground beneath his paws since late August. The frozen fields outside Bancroft, Ontario, did not care about that. The dog's name, according to the faded tattoo inside his right ear, was M709. To the Canadian Forces, he had been military working dog M709. To the 6 operators of JTF-2's Wrecker Squadron who had bled beside him in Mali and Afghanistan, he had been Echo. To Rod Gaskell, who ran Gaskell's Auto Parts and Salvage on a back road off Highway 62, he was $35 of motion sensor that didn't require a monthly subscription fee. 300 kilometers southwest, in a basement apartment in Ottawa's Vanier neighborhood, a woman who hadn't slept properly since Bamako was already pulling on her boots. The January cold in the Kawartha Highlands was merciless. By 10 o'clock at night, the temperature had dropped to -22, and the snow-dusted acres of Gaskell's salvage yard had turned into a landscape from a nightmare. Towers of crushed cars lacquered in ice, frozen engine blocks stacked 6 high, tarpaulins cracking in the wind like rifle shots. In the deepest corner of the yard, behind a collapsed row of stacked sedans, Echo lay curled beneath the undercarriage of the International, his tail wrapped tight over his nose. His tan and black coat, once precision-groomed for operations, was matted and stiff with grease. His ribs pressed clearly against his sides. A pale, jagged scar ran across his left foreleg, shrapnel from a vehicle-borne IED on the road between Gao and Timbuktu 3 years prior. He was still scanning the perimeter. Even now, even starving, his amber eyes swept the yard in a slow, methodical arc. He was still working. He just didn't know for whom anymore. Rod Gaskell was a man of few virtues and fewer obligations. He had purchased Echo through a private liquidation auction held by a Calgary-based security contractor called Meridian Asset Protection. He had driven 11 hours to attend on a tip from a cousin who worked logistics. He had bid on Echo the same way he bid on the surplus tool pallets and the decommissioned surveillance cameras, not because he saw anything in the animal, but because he saw a number that was less than $50. He fed Echo every 2 or 3 days, usually the remnants of a takeout bag tossed from the cab of his truck, and kept him tethered on a chain that allowed 9 feet of movement. When Echo failed to bark at the crows landing on the car stacks, Gaskell would bang a crowbar against the nearest sheet of metal and shout at him from across the yard. He had no idea what he had bought. Echo had been, by every metric the Canadian Special Operations Forces Command used to measure their working dogs, exceptional. He had deployed first to Kandahar Province in 2019, then to northern Mali in 2021 as part of Canada's contribution to Operation Frikrink, attached to a JTF-2 wreck element operating from a forward position north of Gao. He had cleared buildings under fire, located 3 buried pressure plate devices before the vehicles behind him could roll over them, and once, on a nighttime extraction near the Algerian border, had held the outer perimeter of a compromised position alone for 11 minutes, until the quick reaction force helicopter arrived, keeping a 3-man threat at the tree line through sheer controlled aggression and a warning bark that not one of those men chose to test. His handler during those 11 minutes had been Corporal Taryn Hollis. Taryn had joined the Canadian Forces at 22, after 2 years of kinesiology at the University of Calgary. She had tested into the working dog program at CFB Borden on her first attempt, a distinction shared by fewer than 8% of candidates. She was slight and quiet-spoken, and possessed of a stillness that her instructors described in evaluations as operationally rare, the ability to be completely calm in the precise moment when calm was the only thing that would work. Echo had recognized it in her from the first week of their pairing. Dogs always know. The IED that ended Taryn's operational career detonated beneath a Textron Tapfee 4 kilometers outside Gao on a Tuesday morning in March 2022. The blast threw the vehicle 2 meters sideways and sheared off its front axle. Taryn survived. A fractured left orbital bone, a ruptured eardrum, a compressed vertebra, and a traumatic brain injury that required 3 surgeries over 14 months. She was medivaced to the Roll 3 medical facility in Gao within the hour, then transferred to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, then to the National Defense Medical Center in Ottawa. Echo was not with her. Because Echo was uninjured and the unit was mid-rotation, he was transferred to CFB Trenton for reassessment. A logistics warrant officer named Clifton Brower reviewed Echo's files 6 weeks later and determined, on the basis of a single veterinary note about early-onset elbow dysplasia, that the dog was no longer operationally cost-effective. Echo was reclassified as surplus government property and quietly tendered to Meridian Asset Protection under a contract vehicle that nobody in Taryn's chain of command ever formally acknowledged. Taryn had filed the adoption paperwork from her hospital bed in Ottawa. She had filed it 3 times. She had contacted the DND Working Dog Program Coordinator, the base veterinary officer at CFB Trenton, and a member of Parliament on the Standing Committee on National Defence. Each inquiry had produced a different response. The last one, from a communications clerk, stated that Echo had been placed with a qualified handler in the private sector and that the file was closed. The file had not been closed. The file had been buried by a man who looked at spreadsheets instead of souls. Taryn was medically released from the Canadian Forces on a Tuesday in November. She moved into the Vanier apartment. She learned to manage the headaches with blackout curtains and silence. She worked part-time doing remote transcription because it required no fluorescent lighting and no commute, and every night between shifts, she searched. She filed access to information requests. She contacted every private security company holding DND supply contracts. She posted in working dog rescue groups, K9 handler networks, and veterans forums across the country. She hired a skip tracer for 6 weeks. She drove twice to CFB Trenton and was told twice politely that there was nothing she could follow up on in person. Then on a Thursday night in January, at 11 minutes past 1 in the morning, she found him. The photo had been posted in a Facebook group called Canadian Working Dog Sightings and Rescues by a long-haul driver named Francois Lebrun, who had dropped a load of salvage metal at a yard near Bancroft that afternoon and seen something through the chain-link gate on his way back to the cab. The caption read, "Saw this dog chained up at a scrap place near Bancroft on AW62. Looks like hell. Owner told me to mind my business. Dog had a tattoo inside his ear, couldn't read it clearly. Ribs showing. Anyone know who to call?" The image was grainy, shot through 2 layers of chain link and a fine coating of wind-blown snow. But Taryn had spent 2 years memorizing that silhouette, the angle of the ears, the way the dog held his weight on his front legs even when exhausted, the particular, unmistakable set of the shoulders. She sat completely still for 14 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and called Quinn Abara. Quinn answered on the second ring. He had been a JTF-2 sniper for 6 years before transitioning to the RCMP's emergency response team and now worked out of the Ottawa detachment. He had been in the vehicle directly behind Taryn's on the day of the blast. He had been the first one to reach her door. "I found Echo," Taryn said. There was a silence on the line that was not the silence of someone half asleep. It was the silence of someone going very, very still. "Send me the location," Quinn said. Within 4 minutes, Quinn had called Ronan Keefe, Echo's former search and recovery support operator, now civilian, living in Kingston, and Birch Tanaka, the combat medic who had kept Taryn's spine stable in the back of a field ambulance on the road to Gao. Birch was in Toronto. He had already packed a trauma kit before Taryn finished explaining. By 2:30 in the morning, Taryn was on Highway 7 heading northeast, the heater in her Subaru running full, a thermos of coffee wedged between the seats. In the back, Her old kit bag, a bolt cutter she'd purchased at a Canadian tire 3 hours earlier, and a heavy wool blanket still in its packaging. She was 31 years old, medically released, driving through a January blizzard toward a scrapyard to bring her partner home. She had not felt this certain of anything in over 2 years. The meetup point was a Tim Hortons off Highway 62, 19 kilometers south of Bancroft. Quinn's truck was already idling in the lot when Taryn arrived, parked beside a salt-stained pickup belonging to Ronan Keefe. Birch Tanaka pulled in 2 minutes later in a rental. The four of them stood in the parking lot in the wind, breath fogging, and did not waste time on speeches. They had not done that since Mali. Ronan spread a satellite printout across the hood of Quinn's truck, weighted against the wind with an empty coffee cup and a spare magazine. Gaskell's Auto Parts and Salvage, Ronan said. About 5 acres, chain link perimeter, barbed wire topping, looks older, rusted through in at least 2 spots I can see on the imagery. Main office is a double wide at the south entrance. The dog is in the northeast corner, consistent with the angle and background in the photo. Taryn studied the map. We go in quiet. Birch, you hold the south perimeter with eyes on the trailer. Anything moves in there, you call it. Ronan, you find the weak point in the northeast fence and get us through. Quinn, you're with me. We locate Echo, cut the chain, and we're back on the highway before 4. If Gaskell's not alone, Quinn asked. Then we stay calm, we stay legal, and we do not leave without the dog. Nobody argued. At 3:40 in the morning, they killed the headlights and rolled both vehicles off the highway onto the gravel access road leading to the salvage yard, parking on the far side of a granite rock cut where the road bent away from the fence line. The temperature had dropped to -26. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the landscape in absolute silence except for the creak of frozen cedar branches. They moved across the open ground in a loose formation, boots barely audible on the packed crust. Ronan found the northeast corner of the fence in under 4 minutes, a section where the chain link had been pulled away from the lower rail and wired back with baling wire. He cut through it in 3 clean strokes, peeling the mesh far enough for a person to move through. Taryn went first. The interior of the yard smelled of hydraulic fluid, old rubber, and something sweet and chemical she didn't stop to identify. She moved through the rows of stacked cars by memory of the satellite image, counting lanes, keeping her breathing even. The sky was clear and brutally cold, the stars hard and bright overhead. A single security light buzzed somewhere near the south trailer. No movement on the south side, Birch said in her earpiece. Trailer's dark. Taryn rounded the corner of a crushed sedan stack and stopped. She saw the international truck first, then the chain, then the shape curled beneath it. Echo was smaller than she remembered. She knew intellectually that starvation did this. She had studied it, had read the veterinary literature 3 times in the weeks after losing his trail, but knowing it and seeing it were not the same thing at all. His coat had dulled to the color of old straw. His spine was visible even through the matted fur. He lay completely motionless in the way animals lie when they have stopped expecting anything to change. Taryn stood 15 feet away. She pulled off her gloves and tucked them into her jacket pocket, ignoring the -26 on her bare hands. She needed skin. She needed to do this exactly right. She crouched down slowly, bringing herself to his level. She did not call his name. She used something older than words, the specific 3-note whistle she had used at the beginning of every training session. For 2.5 years, the one she had developed with Echo at CFB Borden, the sequence that meant nothing to anyone else on Earth. The shape beneath the International did not move. She whistled it again. One ear moved, just one, swiveling toward her in the dark with the precise mechanical accuracy that had not left him. Then Echo's head lifted, and even in the starlight she could see the confusion in his posture. The way his body tensed and held simultaneously, The way a dog looks when it hears something its own trust will not allow it to believe yet. Taryn held her right hand out, palm up. She kept her weight low and her posture open. She waited. The chain dragged across the ice with a sound like something long overdue breaking. Echo came to his feet. His hindquarters were shaking. Cold, dysplasia, both she couldn't yet know. He took one step toward her, stopped, and his nose began working with a desperate, focused urgencies, pulling the night air apart in layers, sorting through the diesel and the rust and the frozen ground until he reached what he was searching for. He made a sound she had never heard from him before. Not a bark, not a whine, something lower and rawer than either, a sound from a part of him that had quietly given up expecting to be used again. He crossed the remaining distance and walked directly into her chest. Taryn went down onto one knee in the ice. She wrapped both arms around him and pressed her face into the filthy fur at the back of his neck, and stayed there. Echo pressed his full weight against her without hesitation, his body shaking, his nose moving steadily along her collar, checking, verifying over and over what every instinct was already confirming. "I know," she said finally, very quietly. "I know. We're going home." Quinn materialized from the darkness at her shoulder. He carried the bolt cutter and said nothing. He simply knelt beside her, wedged the jaws through the padlock, and applied pressure until the lock cracked apart and the chain dropped to the ice like dead weight. Echo shook his head hard at the sudden absence of it. Then he pressed back against Taryn's leg. "Packages free," Quinn said into his comms. They were 12 meters from the fence gap when the yard erupted. A bank of halogen work lights, mounted on a steel post near the trailer, blasted on with a sound like a transformer detonating, flooding the northeast quarter of the salvage yard in flat white glare that stripped out every shadow and destroyed what remained of their adjusted night vision. A modified car alarm siren began screaming from somewhere near the main office, loud enough to carry a kilometer in the cold air. "Contact," Birch said. "Gaskell is out of the trailer. He's got a rifle. He's not alone." Rod Gaskell came down the center lane of the salvage yard, wearing a Carhartt jacket over long underwear and carrying a bolt-action 30-06 at the low ready. Behind him was a heavyset man Taryn had never seen before, gripping a length of rebar in both hands. Gaskell's face was set in the expression of a man who had decided in advance that he was entirely in the right and did not intend to reconsider. "Nobody moves," he shouted. "I've got every right to defend my property. You want to explain to me what 4 people are doing cutting through my fence at 4 in the morning?" Quinn stepped forward, placing himself between Gaskell and Taryn with a quietness that was itself a kind of warning. He did not raise his voice. "Put the rifle down, Mr. Gaskell," Quinn said. "You are not going to need it tonight." "The hell I won't. That dog is mine. I've got a bill of sale. You're on my property, stealing my property, and I will have every one of you charged before this morning is out." Taryn stood up. She kept one hand resting on Echo's back. She looked at Rod Gaskell across the bleached white light of the work lamps and felt something quieter than rage, something more durable with better range. "His name is M709, she said. Her voice was level and it carried. "He is a retired military working dog with 2 combat deployments completed for the Canadian Forces. He completed 114 active operations in 2 theaters. He located 9 explosive devices that would have killed Canadian and Allied personnel. He was transferred to private sale, while his handler was in hospital recovering from the injuries sustained beside him in the field." She paused. "He weighed 34 kilograms at his last D&D veterinary assessment. He weighs less than that right now." Gaskell's grip on the rifle tightened. "None of that changes the fact that I paid money for him, fair and square." Ronan Keefe stepped out of the shadows behind a crushed Civic, appearing at Gaskell's right at a distance of about 4 meters. He said nothing. His presence alone said enough. Taryn reached into her jacket and set a roll of banknotes on the hood of the nearest wrecked car, $400 in 20s. You paid $35, that's the rest, and then some. Consider it a clean transaction. She met his eyes. And we both know the shed at the back of your property is running parts with ground-off VINs that don't match the vehicles they came from. That's not my concern unless you make it my concern. The certainty left Gaskell's face the way heat leaves a building in January, all at once, through every gap. He looked at the money. He looked at the 4 people arranged around him in the hard white light. He looked at the dog pressed flat against the woman's leg, watching him with the level, patient attention of an animal that had been surprised by human beings too many times to be surprised anymore. He lowered the rifle. "Take the animal," he said, his voice dropping to something almost tired. "He's been nothing but trouble." He turned and walked back toward the trailer without another word. The man with the rebar followed him in silence. Taryn looked down at Echo. "Okay," she said, "let's go." They were on Highway 62, heading south by 4:15, the heater in Taryn's Subaru running full against the -26 outside. Echo lay across the back seat with his head in Taryn's lap. Birch knelt in the footwell and worked with quiet efficiency, swabbing a patch of skin above the foreleg, placing an IV catheter, taping it flat, hanging a warm saline bag from the headrest. The only sounds in the vehicle were the hum of the highway and the shallow, rapid breathing of the dog. "He's malnourished and dehydrated," Birch said, reading the numbers from a portable pulse oximeter. "Core temp is low but not in the danger range. The elbow is inflamed. He's been compensating badly, probably for months. Heart rate is slow but steady." He looked up briefly. "He is in rough shape, but he is not broken." Taryn kept her hand moving slowly along Echo's spine. His breathing was fast and shallow. Then, as the warm fluids began to reach him, it started gradually to slow. The rigid vigilance that had not left his body in 6 months, the taut set of his shoulders, the constant scanning motion of his eyes, finally, degree by degree, let go. He pressed his nose against Taryn's knee and closed his eyes. The Kawartha Highlands slid past in the dark outside, frozen cedar, granite ridges, lake ice catching starlight. The sky ahead of them was still black. They had beaten the dawn. Quinn drove. For a long time no one spoke. "What's the play now?" Ronan asked eventually. "We go on a fence," Taryn said. She was not looking out the window. She was looking at Echo. "I have documentation going back 3 years, the adoption requests I filed from the medical center, the ATIP responses, the Meridian tender documents I pulled through ATI. I know a lawyer." The lawyer's name was Priya Mehta. She practiced military and administrative law out of a firm in Ottawa's Centretown neighborhood, and she had spent the better part of 7 years doing what she described in intake meetings as cleaning up after bureaucrats who should never have been near a consequential decision. When Taryn called her the following morning and laid out the full sequence, the IED in Mali, Clifton Brower's surplus reclassification, the Meridian tender, the salvage yard, Priya went quiet for several seconds. "Send me everything," she said. "Every document, every email, every form you filed from that hospital bed. I want the ATIP responses too, including the ones that gave you nothing." What followed was not a legal proceeding so much as a controlled detonation. Priya did not limit herself to filing a petition. She went to the press simultaneously, providing a full briefing package to the Parliamentary Press Gallery and to a Veteran Affairs correspondent at the Globe and Mail who had been looking for a reason to run this story for months. The public response was immediate and enormous. Within 48 hours, the story had been picked up by CBC, CTV, and Global News. A petition demanding accountability from the Department of National Defense reached 100,000 signatures in 36 hours. The DND Ombudsman opened a file. A member of the Standing Committee on Veterans Affairs issued a formal request for all documents related to the Meridian Asset Protection Contract. Warrant Officer Clifton Brower, the man whose single administrative decision had transferred Echo from the Canadian Forces to a private security company to a scrapyard, was relieved of his posting and called before an internal review board. He did not survive the review. Meridian Asset Protection lost its D&D supply contract and was placed under a compliance audit that would, in the following 18 months, produce findings significant enough to trigger a civil suit. The Department of National Defense, facing what one senior official privately called the worst dog-related public relations event in departmental history, retroactively approved Taryn's original adoption application within 5 days. Echo was formally reclassified as a retired military working dog with honorable service. His military record was updated to reflect all operational deployments, all devices located, all contacts held. His veterinary care was transferred to a specialist at the Ontario Veterinary College in Guelph at no cost to Taryn, under a provision of the D&D Working Dog Welfare Protocol that had existed, entirely unused, for 4 years. 1 year after a January night on a frozen highway north of Bancroft, the walking path along the Rideau River in Ottawa was bright with late afternoon sun, the light off the water coming in long, flat sheets of gold. The trees along the bank had leafed out fully. The path was alive with joggers and cyclists and the easy, ordinary sound of a summer afternoon in a city that did not know what it had nearly lost. Taryn Hollis stood at the edge of the grass where the path opened onto the riverbank, holding a knotted tug rope. She looked different from the woman who had driven through that January blizzard. The shadows under her eyes were nearly gone. She held herself with less effort than she had in years. The stillness that had always defined her was still present, but it no longer felt like armor. It felt like itself. She looked at Echo and threw the rope. He was already moving before it left her hand. He was unrecognizable. His coat had come back thick and glossy, the tan deepened to amber in the summer sun, the black points sharp and clean. He had put on 7 kilograms of healthy muscle. The elbow still slowed him on cold and wet mornings. It always would. But watching him now, driving through the long grass at full sprint, nobody looking at him from the path would have guessed at it. He caught the toy at the top of its arc, turned in a single stride, and came thundering back. He dropped it at Taryn's feet and sat, immediate, perfect, his amber eyes fixed on hers, waiting for the next instruction. The old tattoo inside his right ear caught the light. M709, slightly faded, slightly off-center from the day it was placed, exactly as it had always been. The scar on his left foreleg gleamed in the sun. Taryn crouched down and took his face in both hands, pressing her forehead against the top of his broad skull. "Good lad," she said quietly. "Good lad." Echo's tail beat a slow, steady rhythm against the ground. He had survived a vehicle-borne IED on a desert road in Mali. He had survived 6 months chained to a rusted-out truck in a frozen Ontario scrapyard, starving and forgotten by every institution that had trained him. He had survived being reclassified, tendered, auctioned, and buried in a file stamped closed by a man who had looked at a spreadsheet where a soul should have been. He had survived all of it the same way, by staying ready, by keeping faith with a handler who had not yet arrived, by refusing, even in the worst of it, to stop believing the mission was still active. The bond between a working dog and the person who earned their trust is not a transaction. It cannot be reclassified or tendered or stamped closed. Echo had spent 6 months in a frozen salvage yard waiting for Taryn Hollis, and Taryn Hollis had spent 2 years moving through every bureaucratic wall she could find to get back to him. Neither of them stopped. That is not a story about a dog. That is a story about what loyalty actually costs, and what it has always been worth.